I'm Laura Lucas Magnuson, and this is The World Unpacked.
The Trump administration says it's proceeding with $8 billion worth of arms sales to Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Jordan. In making the decision, Trump bypassed Congress by declaring an emergency over rising tensions with Iran.
President Joe Biden announced on Thursday that the U.S. would no longer support the Saudi Arabia-led military campaign in Yemen, a 6-year conflict that's been widely seen as a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
This war has to end. And to underscore our commitment, we are ending all American support for offensive operations in the war in Yemen, including relevant arms sales.
President Biden is facing growing criticism for failing to sanction Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman for the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. This comes after the U.S. released a new intelligence report Friday directly blaming him for approving Khashoggi's murder in 2018.
I would say the relationship with Saudi Arabia is an important one. We have significant ongoing interests. We remain committed to the defense of the kingdom. But we also want to make sure, and this is what the president has said from the outset, that the relationship better reflects our interests and our values.
The Persian Gulf has long been an area of strategic importance for U.S. security policy, with the United States providing regional allies with weapons sales and other forms of military assistance. However, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and resulting sanctions on Saudi officials, the continued humanitarian disaster in Yemen, and Joe Biden's recent election have prompted discussions among policymakers about a reorientation of U.S. security policy toward the Gulf. Today, we're talking with Frederic Wehrey, a senior fellow in Carnegie's Middle East program and a former U.S. Air Force officer with tours in the Middle East, who advocates in favor of a sweeping rethink of security assistance to the Gulf. Thank you so much for joining us, Fred.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
So President Biden recently announced a temporary pause on a massive sale of advanced arms to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The sale was originally approved by the Trump administration, and the Biden review was called typical by Secretary Blinken. Could you tell us a little bit more about this deal, what was in it, and how Saudi Arabia and the UAE have responded to this pause?
Yeah, it was a massive arms package. I mean, one of the largest in U.S. history. It included sophisticated fifth-generation F-35 jets, Reaper drones, precision munitions to the United Arab Emirates, and also various munitions to Saudi Arabia. The UAE portion was framed really as a reward for the UAE's normalization of relations with Israel, the so-called Abraham Accords. And what we hear from both capitals and their diplomats are the usual talking points, framing this as business as usual, a normal review, underscoring their longstanding partnership with the U.S., highlighting the shared threats that they face with Washington. And the Emirates, in particular, has been quite bold in asserting that their part of the package will, in fact, eventually go through.
And how does all of this relate to the Biden administration's announced plans to end American support for the Saudi-led offensive operations in Yemen?
I think it's certainly linked to that push to end American involvement and support to the intervention. You have to remember the Biden administration includes several former senior-ranking Obama-era officials who were involved in approving and really the architects of the American involvement in the Yemen operation. I think that involvement included intelligence, logistics, munitions, and there's no doubt a sense of buyer's remorse, if not deep regret for how that has transpired. Another, I think, impetus is growing bipartisan support in Congress and really ending what is perceived to be American complicity in this war. And I should also add, there's also mounting congressional scrutiny on other Gulf proxy wars, namely Libya, which you saw several members of Congress sign a letter drawing attention to the Emirates' intervention in Libya, which killed civilians. And I think that certainly factored in as well.
So following the declassification of a report about the murder of Khashoggi, The administration sanctioned some Saudi officials, including the deputy intelligence chief, who are alleged to have been involved in suppression and intimidation of dissidents and journalists. At the same time, however, the administration took no steps to punish the Saudi crown prince, who allegedly was the one who directed the dispatch of the team. What do these moves tell you about Biden's approach to Saudi Arabia?
Well, in some sense, in sort of a broader philosophical sense, they're a reflection of realism and the world as it is. It's a natural dialing back, I think, of the sort of high-minded idealism that marks any president's campaign in favor of a more tempered realism once they get into office. And we have to remember that Biden called Saudi Arabia a pariah state when he was on the campaign trail. Now,
very tough words.
Very tough, very strong for a future U.S. president. I certainly don't want to imply that Biden has jettisoned human rights and values as a pillar of American policy. I think they're still very much a part of his platform, and that's a welcome change. But it's clear that in the case of not sanctioning Mohammed bin Salman, he's walking a tightrope here, right? He is acknowledging that while he wants better human rights behavior, he believes that the future Saudi role with Mohammed bin Salman at the helm of the kingdom is going to be crucial on a number of regional priorities for the United States, like Palestine, Israel, the Iranian nuclear file, counterterrorism. And so the end result was what a spokesperson called a recalibration, not a rupture. And obviously that's a disappointment. We can certainly discuss if that was the correct path. But I think there was probably a calculation that, maybe sanctions would be too high profile. They might incur a backlash, and that there are perhaps more subtle and indirect ways to isolate, discipline, chasten Mohammed bin Salman, correct Saudi behavior inside Saudi Arabia through signaling. And that was, I think, certainly the intention behind Biden's insistence to speak to the king directly as his counterpart and not Mohammed bin Salman.
Yeah, I think that all seemed very carefully thought out and choreographed in terms of the phone call in advance of the report coming out. When you look at all of this together, what conclusions can you draw for us around the policy toward the region? Do you think that we're looking at sort of a modified status quo, a rejection of the Trump era, but only so far? Or do you think that there really will be a larger reassessment of U.S. security policy toward the Gulf?
I think there's a mix of all of those things going on. I think the most obvious and immediate sign is a move toward what we could call a modified status quo, and certainly a departure from the old ways of the Trump administration, which were in many ways a blank check policy toward Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and other Arab autocrats, and really a willful turning of the cheek in the face of egregious abuses and reckless adventurism that not only ran counter to U.S. values, but were not actually advancing U.S. interests in the midst of a rapidly changing strategic landscape. And so the signaling that we've seen from the pause on the arms, the release of the Khashoggi report, the president's insistence to deal with the king rather than Mohammed bin Salman. I mean, all of these signals matter, I think, in terms of the visible, reassertion of a values-based American leadership, both in the Middle East, but also signaling across the world. Now, is it enough in the region? Again, my argument is no. But I think aside from this positive signaling, I think there are deliberations underway right now to take the changes perhaps even farther in terms of rebalancing U.S. policy in the Gulf away from what has essentially been a heavily securitized policy rooted in arms sales, military basing, and security assistance. Now, we have to remember the enormous, obstacles that are up against such an imaginative rethink, I think, of this of policy, and that includes an entrenched, bureaucratic machinery, an institutional culture, a mindset. We're talking here about domestic arms manufacturers, lobby groups for the Gulf, to include former U.S. officials that are now embedded in the Gulf monarchies as advisors, and then also an entire security assistance enterprise within the U.S. military, of which I was a part as a U.S. Air Force officer.
We'll be back in a moment to talk about an alternative path forward. Fred, you've argued in support of a sweeping rethink of U.S. policy toward the Persian Gulf security policy. We'll get to that in a second. I want to ask about U.S. interests in the region. What is the strategic value of having the Gulf alliances, and what would be the consequences if those alliances were strained?
Those are great questions. And again, let me just slightly rephrase the question.
Please.
To ask, do we really have formal alliances with the Gulf states? I think what we've, in terms of real formality, we don't have alliances, with the exception of Bahrain as a major non-NATO ally. I think we have partnerships, right? Mm-hmm. Partnerships that were always built on a degree of expediency and contingency, and the sort of threat-specific partnerships that go back to the Carter Doctrine, which was geared toward the threat of the Soviet Union advancing on the region's oil supplies. Okay, that threat goes away with the end of the Cold War. The new threat is morphed into preventing a local hegemon in the form of Saddam Hussein's Iraq and also Iran from getting the oil. Of course, after the fall of Saddam, then it becomes just Iran. And then in parallel, of course, you had the shared threat of jihadi extremism after 9/11. And so, we've had one threat after the other that has bound us to these allies that were always divergent from us in terms of values and always a bit problematic, especially as we saw after 9/11. And I think what voices inside and outside the administration are realizing is that, the nature and logic of those partnerships need to change, and that the sort of logic of this perpetual war footing that we've been on in the region has weakened. That it's sort of bound us to these allies, or these partners rather, in terms of arms and military basing. And there's real questions about whether those forms of U.S. policy are adequate to address the real types of threats that the U.S. faces, especially in the face of a rising China, in terms of things like climate change, the pandemic, but also in terms of helping the Gulf states address threats that they face in the future. The other point of this is the logic of oil security, right? Again, previously we were dependent on Gulf oil, and one figure I saw today is, the U.S. gets about 13% of its oil from the Gulf, today. And so I think the bottom line is this status quo approach. Has it really served U.S. interests, and at what cost, in terms of the reputational cost of being complicit to domestic repression in the Gulf that we saw after the Arab Spring, and more recently, these proxy wars that the Gulf states have launched in Yemen and Libya and elsewhere. We might also address the question of whether we've gotten a return on our investment in terms of training and equipping these Gulf partners with military assistance. The logic there was, we're going to train their militaries to be more self-sufficient in terms of providing for national defense of these states, and also to participate with us in multilateral operations. And I think, talking to many military officials, this has been a disappointment. I mean, the Gulf states have not reached a level of self-sufficiency from our training where they can truly defend for themselves. When they have attained certain proficiency in certain areas like air power, like special operations forces, they've often used that capability for interventions in ways that don't advance our interests and are counter to our values.
So on the backdrop of those challenges, I know we're going to get in a minute to how you would assess sort of a rethink, but in current policy, are there any foreign policy tools that the United States is actually using well, do you think?
Well, this reminds me of a trip I made to Saudi Arabia in 2013, and I met with students and activists in 3 locations: in Jeddah, in the capital Riyadh, and in the Eastern Province. And everywhere I met young people who had received their education, undergraduate or graduate, in the United States, and they were rattling off names of universities. I mean, Ohio State, Georgetown, UCLA. And it was quite astounding to me, the enthusiasm they had for that educational experience. And I think that was an important pillar of our policy that was mutually beneficial, mutually respected. An entire generation of young Saudi students received their education in the States. And that was an important vehicle for the transmission of values, for building goodwill, for equipping young Saudis to compete in the global economy. And of course, it's tragic when these sorts of educational exchanges are cut for political reasons. But I do think that epitomizes the direction that U.S. policy should be going in the Gulf in terms of more, people-to-people ties, that we've often sacrificed that line of influence in favor of arms sales. The Gulf has an increasingly youthful, dynamic population. They're hungry to engage with the world. There is, in many cases, respect for the U.S. In terms of our, as a place of education, in terms of our culture, and we need to capitalize on that.
I couldn't agree more. As a former public affairs foreign service officer out in the field, you're speaking my language right now. So bravo.
Great.
All right. So let's talk about this sweeping rethink of U.S. security policy in the Persian Gulf. What are you envisioning? Tell us a little bit about what this would encompass and how it differs from current policy.
Right. Well, just to segue from the previous point, again, I'm not arguing a jettisoning of the partnership or discarding these countries as partners, but redefining the relationship more broadly to widen it to include things like support to society, people-to-people ties, trade, energy, climate change. And I think moving away from this overly securitized focus that has privileged really the military line of influence. I mean, Gulf states, Gulf officials have long preferred to deal with the Pentagon, to deal with U.S. military. They've received steady streams of arms. They're hosting, U.S. military forces, and it's created a security dependency that, as we've discussed, has not actually advanced U.S. interest. But I think it's come at the expense of other things, and I think we have to emphasize here, that there's a narrow bandwidth, and that if that bandwidth is crowded out by the military line of influence, and I don't mean to jettison the military line of influence either. I think there is a proper role for certain types of U.S. Military assistance to include defensive weapons, air defense. But again, just widening the aperture to include these broader people-to-people ties is what I mean by a sweeping rethink.
And I know that viewpoint is shared by some in the more progressive foreign policy community. Certainly, there's been a really active debate on this topic over the last couple of weeks. But what are the arguments against such a rethink? What would sort of your critics say? Why might some people argue that the security relationship is actually too important to upend, including arms sales to Saudi Arabia?
Well, what you hear is again, that these arms are necessary for deterrence, for regional stability, that this is a rough neighborhood, that there are, threats, namely the threat from Iran. And I think we're going to discuss later what the nature of that threat is and how to confront it. But again, what you find is this logic of threat. So we need to sell these partners, advanced weaponry. I think another argument is that if we give them these weapons, we do maintain some degree of control over how they are used, especially in terms of the long logistics and service trail that accompanies these weapons. So we get more control if we give them the weapons, as opposed to them getting it from somewhere else. Right. That's the other argument. Look, they're going to get these weapons from somewhere. Why not us rather than the Chinese and the Russians? We could talk about that in a bit. There's the other argument that, the arms sale and security relationships create a shared understanding, people-to-people ties. Thousands of Gulf military students have received their education at U.S. military schools, and that those military relationships, people-to-people ties within the military, give us leverage access, understanding. There's always a bit of truth to that, but I think the value of that has been far outweighed by, as we've mentioned, the reputational costs and damage that we've seen from this very securitized approach in terms of abuses and proxy wars.
You mentioned Iran, so yeah, let's talk about Iran. Countering Iran has been and remains a high priority for U.S. administrations. Given your argument against the status quo, but understanding the immense challenge that Iran poses, what would be a more effective strategy in your view?
Again, Iran's threat to the region has never been, purely military in terms of a conventional military. It's ever since the 1979 revolution, it's been ideological, right? The Iranian regime has promoted a very destabilizing message across the region. And then, of course, more recently, they've waged asymmetric warfare. Again, we're talking about military support to non-state militias and proxies. Increasingly, they're using cyber and missiles. And I do absolutely want to acknowledge and appreciate the lethality and destructiveness of Iran's non-state strategy across the region to armed groups. I've been on the receiving end of missiles in Iraq that were fired by Iranian-backed militias, both in 2003 and later in 2008. And obviously, we've seen tragically outspoken activists murdered in Lebanon and Iraq. So Iran is a very real threat. And I think the U.S. is rightly focused on countering that asymmetric threat, through intelligence and clandestine means, through financial sanctions on these groups, through cyber war, and when needed, through overt airstrikes, as the one we just witnessed recently. And in terms of missiles, we can provide discrete assistance to counter the Iranian missile threat through air defense systems. But I want to underscore that the sort of massive stream of conventional weapons that we're pouring into the Gulf, like these, fifth generation fighters, other forms of military hardware, they don't actually counter the Iranian threat. It's the wrong medicine for the affliction. And in some cases, it's actually fueling, I think, the escalation, because in the Iranian worldview, and I'm not justifying it, I'm not empathizing with, I'm trying to explain it, they see a militarized encirclement by Arab states backed by the United States, a militarized encirclement by the Gulf backed by the United States. And their way to respond to that is through these non-state proxies.
So Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is visiting the Gulf this week. What is your response to the question you actually asked yourself, I think, a few minutes ago about, what if the U.S. doesn't provide enough security support? The Gulf states will flock to Russia and China. What's the argument there?
Right. I mean, the argument we hear from the Gulf is that, well, you're abandoning us. We have no choice but to turn to Russia and China. And I want to emphasize, this is not a new argument. I heard it personally from Gulf officials, back in the late 2000s, when there was talk about the drawdown in Iraq, and there was a perception in the Gulf that the U.S. was leaving the region then. And there was, Gulf states were saying, look, we're going to turn to China. I think a few points. First of all, that diversification is already happening. They are entertaining and buying weapons from other sources. But, a few points to push back on that. I think, obviously, they're getting, in many cases, a second-rate product. I mean, there's obviously China is making real advances, but it still doesn't equate to what the U.S. can offer. And there's often over-promising by Russia. Russia promises, but often doesn't actually deliver on a lot of these systems. I think what we're going to see is, at best, a supplementing, but not a supplanting of the U.S. as a security provider. And why is that? Well, because in many cases, these other states, when they sell arms, they're not offering what the U.S. brings, which is a broader insurance policy and a broader commitment. And so I think that's what the Gulf states really have in mind when they buy arms from the U.S. is they're not just purchasing the hardware, they're purchasing the entire relationship of service, of people, and that translates into a broader guarantee for defense. And the Russians are not willing to take up that burden of defense. The Chinese certainly don't want to play that game. What we've seen from them currently, this may change in the future, but currently is a very mercantilist attitude where they're not willing to play in the security game because security provision game, because they're simply selling the weapons. They don't want to replace the U.S. as a security provider. So all this taken in sum, I think, is to say, we should be obviously worried about Chinese inroads and Russian inroads, but the notion of them displacing us and that these Gulf states are, going to flock into the arms or to the camp of Moscow and Beijing, I think is greatly exaggerated.
We'll be right back to talk about how America's policies toward the Gulf unfold on the ground. Fred, we've been taking a really high-level view of U.S. policy here, but you've actually been on the front lines, as you said, throughout the Middle East, watching the ramifications of Washington's policy choices. Tell us a little bit about being in Libya during an Emirati attack on Libyan pro-government fighters in November 2019.
Right. Well, ever since Libyan militia forces under the command of Eastern warlord Khalifa Haftar launched their attack on the Libyan capital in April of 2019, Emirati military support was crucial to that attack, and it really was most starkly felt in the form of these armed drones that were flying in support of his ground forces. These drones were an ideal form of intervention for the Emirates. They were cheap, very lethal, and deniable. And certainly their effect was significant on the ground, especially psychologically. And I was with these pro-government militia fighters who were faced with these drones overhead. And it was indeed terrifying because you could not move your vehicle without being targeted. You were always afraid of being spotted. You always had an ear to the sky, listening for that hum of the drone. And once you heard it, you had to get under shelter very quickly. And this is a new form of warfare, right? Libya, unfortunately, has been a laboratory for drones from both sides. Libyans and other civilians have, unfortunately, paid the price. The Emirati drone intervention has, in fact, been quite reckless in terms of targeting civilians. This has been well documented by the United Nations, by human rights groups. And again, in several instances, I came upon the aftermath of these drone strikes against civilians, which killed civilians in some cases. In one case in November, I arrived within several hours of an Emirati drone strike on a biscuit factory that the Emirati drone operators had mistaken for an arms depot. I arrived just a couple hours. The wreckage was still smoldering. They'd taken away the civilian corpses. 8 civilians died, but very clearly in the impact craters, you could see the wreckage of these Emirati drone missiles, and there was no military value to this site. And this was later reflected in United Nations reports. And it just goes to underscore that here you have a close U.S. ally acting in a very irresponsible way, breaking a UN arms embargo, supporting a warlord that is also colluding with Russia. And so this is happening in ways that certainly do not advance U.S. interests.
I mean, Libya is an arena in the region where, as you said, Russian and Chinese influence is also playing a significant role. How have you observed, examples of that influence in your travels?
Again, Russian mercenaries on the ground in Libya were a decisive factor in Haftar's advance on the capital in the late fall of 2019. These mercenaries from the so-called Wagner Group, closely aligned with the Pentagon, the Kremlin, they're often really considered a paramilitary arm of the Kremlin. They arrived on Tripoli's front lines in September, and I arrived on the battlefield in November. And what I saw was that they were assisting Haftar's forces with artillery, with snipers, with really increasing the precision of his advance. And there's an argument that Wagner is they're not that great. They're not an exemplary military by any stretch. But in Libya, that didn't really matter because they were enough. They were just enough to help Haftar gain territory. And that really spooked the Tripoli government forces. And as a result, they turned to Turkey, who provided military support of their own in the form of mercenaries and more drones. And so what I think the Russian intervention did is it really internationalized this conflict. It invited the Turkish intervention. Unfortunately, now that there is a ceasefire, there is a peace. There are peace talks underway. There is a new provisional government. But what you have now is Russia embedding itself in Libya, refurbishing air bases, digging in, bolstering air defenses. The Wagner mercenaries are not leaving. And I think that's a real tragedy. You have Russian, military influence in this oil-rich African state on NATO's flank. And I do want to underscore that this was partly the result of, again, Emirati intervention. The Emirates worked directly with the Russians, and according to a Pentagon report, the Emirates actually paid for those Wagner mercenaries. And I think this is just one more example of a close U.S. partner that is working in ways in these proxy conflicts that run counter to American interests.
And going back to Iran for a moment, you've already talked about your experience on the ground in Iraq, seeing Iranian proxy forces at work. How have your experiences as a former U.S. intelligence officer in the region informed the policy recommendations we've been talking about?
Right. Well, I do want to underscore that I worked as a Iran analyst on the Joint Staff J2 in 2002 before the Iraq War, and then I deployed to Iraq in 2003 as an intelligence officer. And in both cases, I did acquire a real appreciation for Iran's clandestine influence, its support to these, militias, and the Quds Force under the late Soleimani was indeed a very menacing arm of Iranian policy in the region. But I something else, came to my mind as an intelligence officer is that the nature of Iranian influence over these proxy groups is not automatic. In many cases, they don't always do what Iran wants them to do. And I think more importantly, Iran's influence in the region has always been, opportunistic, right? The Iranians have been very good at exploiting fissures, political fractures in the Arab world, wars that start in the Arab world, interventions, mistakes by U.S. policy. Again, we have to remember that Iran would not have come into Iraq were it not for the U.S. toppling of Saddam Hussein. And again, I was there right after he fell, and we were completely unprepared for what Iran was doing in terms of coming in. But again, that was the result of a U.S. misstep. And again, there were multiple other cases where Iran has exploited mistakes. Again, why did Iran sink its teeth into Lebanon and establish Hezbollah? It was because of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. The same thing in the Syrian civil war. They exploited the marginalization in Yemen. They exploited really the Saudi intervention in Yemen. Their influence over the Houthis was not as great before that intervention. But again, in times of conflict, it really escalated. Same thing with the Saudi blockade of Qatar. That gave them an opening to build relations with Qatar. And so I guess the point, what I'm seeing in sort of in all of this is Iran is indeed a menace. And when you're an intelligence officer, you're focused on that. But we also have to look at the broader, political context in terms of, policies and missteps and how Iran is exploiting that. The other point that I'll make that came to me as an intelligence officer is we have strong and productive relationships with a number of Arab states, including authoritarian Arab states, on the intelligence level. And that intelligence sharing has indeed been beneficial in terms of thwarting plots. This has been well proven in the Saudi case. But I think there's a danger in relying on that shared intelligence as sort of our eyes and ears in the region, that we get too closely bound to these authoritarian Arab states in terms of that intelligence relationship. We're focused on jihadism, we're focused on the Iranian threat, and it blinds us to the broader question of strategic predictive intelligence about what is happening in those states themselves, right? Intelligence, good intelligence, you're going to be looking at politics, societies, economics, dissent, opposition parties. We don't want to get blindsided by a strategic surprise in these states. And I'll just say that actually happened in the case of Libya, and I document this in my book. I was at the U.S. Embassy working as an attaché in Libya in the run-up to the 2011 revolution. We had a very strong bilateral intelligence relationship with Gaddafi on, cooperating on jihadism and al-Qaeda. And I think that to a degree blinded us in terms of anticipating the revolution, what was happening inside Libyan society. So again, that's would be my sort of bottom line is, yes, let's work with our partners on these shared threats, but let's also keep an eye on what's happening inside those states and get back to this priority of predictive intelligence.
That makes a lot of sense. 2 last policy questions for you. The first is, on a rethink of policy toward the Gulf, there are a number of non-traditional security threats that are emerging that especially the Biden administration is seized with. Things like climate change, the pandemic we're still in the middle of, cyber attacks, which seem to come sort of weekly at this point. What type of support can the U.S. offer for counteracting these threats? If you think about, and you have so nicely explained, the sort of broadening of the relationship beyond just one way of looking at it.
Yeah, identifying these challenges is quite easy, but, influencing them with the existing toolkit that the United States has is difficult. It's difficult for a government to sort of shape, non-government affairs, to go beyond an authoritarian government and reach directly down into the society. That's always been a challenge. And one of the reasons why we've maintain these military relationships is because it's easy, right? And so it's, we've been very good at having this hammer, and so every problem looks like a nail. Whereas these new threats, climate change, the pandemic, we're grappling as a country with how we deal with those, and so our assistance to these countries needs to change. I don't have an easy answer to that. I think you'll probably appreciate this, but I think obviously bolstering, traditional diplomacy, funding the State Department, bolstering USAID to the extent we can get more traditional diplomats into these countries, engaging in those sorts of conversations, not just with elites, but with business, with students, with society, that can help to shape, outlooks on these various challenges. I think there are various multilateral institutions that deal with things like climate change that we can encourage. I think the one aspect is considering a new form of multilateral security for the Gulf that would gradually supplant or replace the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is really an outmoded security institution. And so how do we encourage that institution to take on more deliberations like climate change, like cyber, like pandemic, like public health, these sorts of things?
Last question, also a tough one. We haven't really talked about democracy and human rights beyond sort of thinking people to people. But the Biden administration has made clear that those issues are absolutely fundamental to its foreign policy. How should we be thinking about, or maybe how would you recommend, if you were inside, that the Biden administration should be thinking about democracy and human rights in the Gulf? How best to promote it, understanding where the region is?
Right. Well, those are tough questions. I obviously think we should be caring a great deal, and I think Biden is headed in the right direction here. Obviously, again, it's difficult to do this sort of policy and promotion when you're faced with these entrenched, governments. We're not going to be opening an office of the National Democratic Institute in Riyadh anytime soon. These governments have strong incentives to prevent those kinds of lines of influence from coming into their countries. I do think in this virtual age, there are ways of reaching people, of signaling through public diplomacy, through the virtual realm, through social media. So there are ways of reaching the people in these countries. And I think there are ways of standing up and showing visible and more than symbolic, but political support for imprisoned activists, calling out these regimes on abuses and violations. And we've seen that, again, with the release of the Khashoggi report, with various congressional moves. I think greater statements by key leaders matter. Again, the Gulf states have always dealt with the U.S. on a very personal level. And so what senior officials say matters. And I think, very public naming and shaming by senior officials. I think many of these Gulf states are trying to construct an image to the world that they are tolerant and they are open. And I think any sort of signaling or statements that run counter to that embarrass them, I think that does have an impact on their thinking. We shouldn't expect democracy overnight. We shouldn't be aiming for that, but at the very least, promotion of the rule of law, greater transparency, greater freedom of the press. Again, standing up for imprisoned journalists. And again, it's not only consistent with our values, but I think it's going to push these states in a very healthy direction in terms of opening up and pursuing gradual reform, because we have to remember, I think, that they are going to be confronted, not in the next couple of years, maybe not in the next directly in the next decade, but eventually, I think they're going to face significant challenges because the old ways, the old bargain of doing things where they have kept repression in their societies, paid off dissent with oil wealth. We're entering the looming end of the oil era, right? And so these states are gradually facing declining revenues from oil, and so they're going to have to envision a new social contract for their countries. And I think the degree to which we can nudge them along that path will not only advance U.S. interests, but I think ensure their own survival as well.
A point well made, and one that I think many of our Carnegie colleagues in the region do so as well. So thank you so much for joining us today, Fred.
My pleasure. Thank you, Laura.
Till next time. Thank you for listening to The World Unpacked, produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We're grateful for your listen and eager for your feedback. We welcome your emails at podcasts@ceip.org. And please rate and review us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find me, Laura Lucas Magnuson, on Twitter @LauraL.Magnuson. These discussions are only made possible by our wonderful team behind the pod. Our audio engineer is Tim Martin, and our executive producer is Maya Krishna Rogers. We'll see you next time.